Hello, it's Dr. Bennett again. I'm here for our last video lecture of the semester. If you look back at the timeline, you'll see that we are now moving into the last phase of the literary movements that I have listed on that timeline. And this phase is called postmodernism. So we just finished discussing modernism, which runs from about 1914, around World War I, up to about the 1950s, right? We also talked about the Harlem Renaissance, which was happening at the same time. And there is some overlap between modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. Both are looking at a modern world and addressing that world and using sometimes forms that are not traditional. One difference that we noted is that the Harlem Renaissance writers were trying to raise up folk forms and write to an audience of common readers instead of kind of educated philosophical readers who were part of the academy, for example. T.S. Eliot would be somebody that we would think of as writing kind of complicated poetry that not just anybody can pick up and read because they may not know all the allusions that he's making, the people he's referring to in his poems. So postmodernism comes after both of those. Postmodernism begins in the 1950s and goes until about the 1990s. So it's fairly recent. For me, it's very recent. And I'll just say, because we're not going to come all the way up to the very present, that some say that we're still sort of in an era of postmodernism. We still see some characteristics of the postmodern era in our own times. But I'll explain a little bit about why we have moved on from postmodernism proper since the 1990s. But how do we understand what the postmodern era is? What are we looking for in trying to identify postmodern literature, for example? Well, if you remember, modernism saw the world as fragmented. Remember, Eliot sort of saw Western civilization as something that had crumbled, had not fulfilled its promise. And he, as an artist, was trying to sort of pull together the fragments and make something new out of them. So implied in that process is that he thinks he can make something new that is coherent. So even though the modernists are very aware of a fragmented or shattered world, they're still trying to make sense out of human existence. So they're trying to make a unified or coherent picture. Postmodernism, however, although it also sees the world as shattered and fragmented, it resists the urge to try to put it back together. Instead, it sort of plays in the fragments. It doesn't trust things that look unified or whole, because postmodernists believe that nothing is completely coherent. That if somebody tells you an explanation of the world that seems really good and coherent and everything's kind of fitting into its place, that there's something probably deceptive about that picture. They believe that if you imagine a mirror, you're looking into the mirror and you see yourself, right? You see your whole self and it makes sense. Your nose is where it's supposed to be and all of that. For the postmodernists, it's like they're looking in a shattered mirror, and instead of trying to tape it all back together and see themselves in that mirror, they sort of look at the cracks. They're interested in what we can learn from those cracks, from the gaps in the picture. So they consider our world to be one that is made up mostly of our perceptions. They're seeing the world subjectively, like the modernists are. They believe that really the only lens we have on the world is our own, and it's affected by our experiences and a kind of shifting notions about who we are and what the world is. And so the world can even be in flux. It can even change, right, as our perceptions change. They believe that systems and theories and myths, for example, religions that explain human existence, that those systems have gaps in them, cracks, flaws, and that we have to be very aware of those because they have a lot of power over us. And if we can identify the cracks, then we can begin to kind of regain understanding of what the world really looks like. So one of the things that we will see is we will start, instead of having the big story or the grand narrative that tells about the human experience, the universal human experience, which we get from myths. And when I use the word myth, I don't mean lies necessarily. I mean stories, systems of stories that explain human existence, that explain our relationship to our world and our relationship to each other. That includes the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Um, it also includes the Greek mythologies, Native American mythologies. All cultures have those stories. So the postmodernists would say any system of those stories is only going to give us part of a picture, right? But it has, up until recently, kind of dominated our understanding of our world and ourselves. And so you'll see in diving into the wreck that the diver has always understood herself by reading those mythologies. She didn't look directly at herself. Instead, she let them tell her who she was and what her value was and what her role was. So you can imagine that, right? We've all been taught those things. We kind of have learned who we are in the world, what our relationship is to other people by having a story told to us about that. So this idea that the world has been kind of constructed for us by stories, by media, by language is a key to understanding the postmodern perspective. Everything is constructed, right? There's no such thing as absolute truth for postmodernists. And what we've learned as truth has been constructed by humans pretty much. So that includes reality. And whether you believe it or not, we're all children of the postmodern era because you yourself probably got on the internet today or on your phone or wherever, and let's say you went to Instagram. You exist in Instagram, right? Is that you? Well, it's at least your avatar. It's something you constructed. It's an identity that you constructed and presented back to your community in Instagram. You're getting those same kind of identities given to you from your friends in Instagram. The whole world of Instagram is a virtual world, right? It is what we would call a kind of a meta universe, right? So it is a kind of false world in a way, right? It's not the same as something you can touch or feel. It does have a realness to it, but it is also, we know, heavily constructed, and it's also heavily constructed by language and images. So one reason postmodernism kind of took momentum in the 1950s and 60s was because of television. So one of the big differences between culture from about 1900 up to 1950 is that you didn't have television. You had images, right? You had newspapers, you had magazines, you might even have a billboard, from time to time. But around the 1950s, images exploded into our culture. So now images are being piped into every person's home, right? And beyond 1950, you just had more and more and more television screens. I mean, right now in my own house, I can't even tell you how many screens we have, but I know we have at least 8 TVs. And so we're surrounded by digital versions of reality coming at us, right? And marketing entities take advantage of that. So they feed us images. They kind of create our reality for us. And, postmodernism really started in a time before the internet. But what we can see is that the effects of that imagery, of having our world constructed for us by medium, something that is between us and reality, that's reflecting reality, is that up to a point, we don't even see the actual reality very much anymore. What we see is a screen version of that, right? Something that's going through the airwaves. So we are children of the postmodern era in that we know that. Every time you get online, even though you may be affected by the images you're seeing, and I think psychologists would say we can't escape being affected by them. We might think we're not, but we are. Our whole understanding of the world is being shaped by those images. Postmodernists would say that um, that the children of the postmodern era will understand that those are images, right? We know better. We know better than to think that we get on Instagram to find the truth. Truth is a moving target now, right? And we understand that because we know that there are motives out there. Everybody has their own reasons, their own agenda for how they present reality to us. So we are very used to that. Doesn't mean it doesn't create some anxiety though. Sometimes we yearn for a kind of absolute truth, right? Our world is a very shifting one. It's in flux. But we do kind of learn to navigate in it, and we learn to survive in it. And one of the things we learn is to try to be wary so that those versions of reality that are being fed to us don't dominate us, right? So that's one of the things that the postmodernists were very concerned about, was that we might be dominated by the grand narrative, the story that we're supposed to believe about human existence. So with the grand narrative, one of the ways that postmodern writers battled that narrative that's got so much power, that tells us what we're supposed to be, is that they began to recognize voices that were telling little stories, voices that might not have been heard before. Before the 1950s, honestly, the vast majority of people publishing fiction, poetry, everything else was white men. After the 1950s, you remember we also had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. We start to hear from a lot more people that are a lot more diverse. That doesn't mean we stop hearing from white men, but it means we add a whole bunch of new voices. So as I mentioned in the sheet that I gave you, the information about postmodernism, the little stories that we're looking at are Cisneros' story, Woman Hollering Creek, which is the story of Cleophilus, who wouldn't have had a voice, and still in our culture today probably doesn't really have a voice publicly, not much. And also the diver in Diving into the Wreck, because she's a voice of someone who's more around the 60s and 70s, because she's a female, and she's been taught a history that's a very masculine history, right? So she's trying to find herself in there, and the only way she could do it is to dive down into that wreck and just go look at it. And it is a wreck. It's not a beautiful ship floating on top of the sea. It's one that's been damaged. It's been sunk down into the subconscious. It's been buried. But she can go down there and have the courage to go and look at it. And that's kind of the big step that she makes. So one more thing other than media that I want to mention is language. Postmodern thinkers and critics, people in literature and art, are very interested in the power of language. They suddenly begin to really talk about the power that language has over us, how it shapes how we see the world. If you think about the difficulty we're having right now with our pronouns, what do we call someone who is non-binary, gender-wise? We only have 2 words to refer to people, he or she. Why? Because those are the words that humans created when they started making sounds. Every culture has its own language, and where there are different words for those things. But languages are very limited, and they reflect our values. That's one of the things that the postmodernists really emphasize, is that there are values being reflected in language. So it's something important to think about. And a man named Derrida came up with an explanation that anything we think of as a sign, like you just imagine a stop sign, that it's not just an absolute thing. Stop doesn't exist out in the universe somewhere in its pure form, right? It's not an absolute thing. The idea of stopping your car is a fairly consistent notion that we can now, it even crosses languages, right? Stop at a red light or a stop sign. But one thing Derrida wanted us to stop and think about is that the sign is made up of 2 things. The signifier, like the word stop or the image of a stop sign, those are signifying something, right? Those are giving us a message. That's a signifier. And the signified. The signified is the idea that it's trying to reflect. So stopping itself is a concept. The sign is trying to reflect that concept. And one thing he was getting at was the signifier and the signified, they are not glued together. They move around. So when I use the word freedom, some of you may immediately think of the concept of freedom that I mean when I say the word freedom. But probably if we have 25 people in the class, we're going to get 25 different, slightly different versions of definitions of that word. So the concepts of freedom and the word freedom are kind of slippery. Their relationship is kind of slippery. That is an idea that's kind of at the base of postmodern studies of language and its role in human civilization. And it's fun. It's also kind of leads us to never being able to quite trust anything as being absolute, but it also can be liberating. If some of these concepts have been sort of trapping us, we can now sort of throw them off, right? We can say, well, this notion of Christianity that I've been handed, maybe there are other ways to think about it, right? Maybe I can interpret, let's say, a verse from the Bible differently than someone else. It kind of liberates it. It kind of releases that those words from the interpretation that somebody insisted on. So I'm going to stop there because that's a lot to think about. Please go back to the sheet that I linked for you so you can review some of these ideas. Postmodernism is a very complicated movement, but once you see examples of it and you start to see instances of some of the things I've been mentioning when you're looking out at culture, you might say, oh yeah, okay, here's another example of what she was talking about. Then I think over time it starts to make more and more sense. All right, thanks.